So we're going to take a look at purple hibiscus now through the lens of adolescent development. So this novel was originally published in 2003, and it's set in Nigeria during a period of political turmoil, and it follows the journey of teenage siblings Kambili and Jaja as they navigate the complexity of adolescence. So there's a lot of powerful themes like family dynamics, the quest for freedom, identity formation, and personal growth amid adversity. And of course, all these themes resonate very strongly with development. So here we have a little background on the family environment. The father's strict Catholic fundamentalism and extreme control through abuse. And the oppressive environment really limits the normal adolescent development of the two siblings. Kabili is initially presented as shy, obedient, and fearful of failure, with her self worth entirely dependent on her father's approval. And this really demonstrates how her identity development has been compromised by the family dynamics. I think in contrast, Jaja exhibits early signs of rebellion and resistance, representing a more typical adolescent path of striving for autonomy and self identity. In any event, this slide is really highlighting how the siblings respond differently to the authoritarian parenting during this critical stage of their development. Central focus of this slide is the key challenges faced by adolescent characters in the novel, right? So the first challenge is the domestic violence and controlling nature of the father, which is creating an environment of fear rather than security and disrupting that normal adolescent exploration of identity and boundaries. I think the second challenge is the political and social instability in Nigeria. We've got military coups, censorship, and unrest, which are all providing a very turbulent background for the character's development, adolescent development specifically. So the third challenge is the dialectic between familial oppression and the character's emerging desire for personal freedom. So that's a central developmental task, in this case, intensified by their difficult circumstances. So, three key challenges: domestic abuse, political upheaval, and the struggle for autonomy form the core obstacles that our adolescent protagonist must navigate in this novel. So, of course, we know that domestic violence can have severe psychological impacts, particularly on adolescents and children. And we see that through the character of Kambili. She exhibits chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, and developmental trauma that affects her attachment patterns and self concept. Kambili's isolation and restricted interaction also impairs her social skills and suppresses normal adolescent exploration and identity expression. However, the novel also shows how adolescents can develop adaptive mechanisms like things like acute observational skills and internal fantasy life and protective sibling bonds. So exposure to a more nurturing environment like their aunt's household can also help foster resilience in these adolescents, right? So I think the takeaway and the insight for us as counseling professionals working with youth is there's quite a few things here to think about on this slide, especially if they've experienced domestic violence, right? So Kambili's journey from a state of protected ignorance to a new, more authentic identity is represented on the slide. It begins with Kambili's initial state of naive acceptance of her father's authority despite the abuse she experiences. And I think the catalyst is her exposure to a different family dynamic during a visit to her aunt's home, which creates cognitive dissonance. And this leads to a transformation where Kambili starts forming independent thoughts, questioning her religious beliefs, and experiencing her first romantic attraction. So the resolution shows how both Kambili and her brother Jaja emerge into more authentic versions of themselves despite the tremendous personal costs. And This trajectory illustrates the common adolescent journey from innocence to self-awareness, in this case complicated by trauma and oppression. So key themes are the loss of innocence, self-realization, and the impact of a restrictive environment. So Erickson's stages of psychosocial development provide a framework for understanding the key challenges individuals face. And here we're looking at identity versus role confusion, where Kambili and Jaja are in this moment. Then, of course, it's a very critical period for developing a sense of self and direction in life. So while their fathers control initially suppressed their identity formation, we see Kambili and Jaja gradually asserting their independence and self-awareness. Um, for example, Kambili's growing self-awareness as well as Jaja's refusal to take communion demonstrate their emerging identities. So we also see remnants of the earlier industry versus inferiority stage, where Kambili's academic performance anxiety and need for validation suggest incomplete resolution of this conflict. So their dad's high expectations and harsh punishments have really distorted their sense of competence in this stage. Finally, I think we have early signs of intimacy versus isolation evident in Cambili's attraction and her developing capacity for emotional connection outside of the family. So I think this is suggesting how their identity formation lays the groundwork for any future or for their future intimate relationships. So I think Adichie's protagonists demonstrate key cognitive advances, right? The ability to think abstractly and question religious dogma, um, stronger moral reasoning beyond rigid rules, envisioning alternative futures and possibilities, critically evaluating authority figures. I mean, the novel is also, so that's on the cognitive end. It's also showing us complex emotional growth, so that transition from suppressed to more expressive emotions, the development of empathy and concern for others, the emergence of romantic feelings and attraction. So, struggle with conflicting emotions towards an abusive parent is also there. And these developmental processes really occur despite the challenging family context. And I think it's highlighting adolescent resilience. So, Kambili's extreme shyness and limited social skills stem from her father's strict restrictions on interactions outside the family. So, her cousins provide her and her brother with peer-like interactions within the safety of the family. And this ultimately serves as a bridge, helping her develop broader social competence. So Kambili's contrasting school experiences, which is a prestigious but socially stunted environment, versus a less resourced but more socially rich one, highlight how the educational setting can influence adolescent social development. So Kambili's gradual ability to form connections outside the family represent um, pretty critical developmental achievement and a marker of her growing psychological health. So the novel is looking at how adolescent identity formation is shaped by the complex religious landscape in Nigeria. So we've got tensions between Catholic fundamentalism and traditional beliefs. And so adolescents' moral development and worldview are significantly influenced by this multifaceted religious context. So Nigeria's post-colonial struggles and political instability create a backdrop that I think mirrors the internal turbulence experienced by the adolescent characters. So, questions of national identity parallel the personal identity formation process of them, and the contrasting family models depicted from a patriarchal authoritarianism to a more democratic household, I think demonstrates how various variations in cultural family structures provide profoundly impact adolescent development. So I think Adichie's presenting adolescence as inherently embedded within specific cultural contexts, which is ultimately shaping the developmental trajectories and possibilities of the characters. So I think this book is really a coming of age story. So it's highlighting the protagonist's initial innocence, challenging experiences that prompt growth, and the role of mentorship figures. I think there are parallels between the novel's structure and the psychological and moral development that occurs during adolescence, including that movement from external to internal locus of control and the integration of traumatic experiences. So, unlike Western coming of ages that emphasize individualism, Adichie balances individual growth with communal responsibility. And I think these points help situate this novel into a very rich literary tradition and shed light on the depth of Kambili's coming of age journey. So, adolescents who are experiencing family oppression may exhibit subtle signs of abuse, like Kambili's silences and schedule obsession. It's important to recognize these cues during assessment, and we also want to evaluate the developmental impacts across different domains, emotional, social, academic, etc., which will help us understand the full scope of the challenges being faced. Assessing safety concerns and reporting obligations is critical. We have to ensure the client's well-being while navigating any legal or ethical requirements. We want to identify strengths and protective factors. That's important, and these can really serve the foundation for therapeutic work. I think trauma-informed counseling practices are essential because that's really going to create a sense of safety and predictability. In this case, I think narrative approaches can be powerful in helping someone reconstruct their personal stories and reclaim their sense of identity. So keep in mind that these adolescents may struggle with trust, have difficulty expressing their feelings, experience conflicting loyalties, and need extensive validation. So that strong therapeutic alliance is key. Just let you read this for a sec. So as we can see, adolescence is obviously a very critical period of development, and it's really where early childhood experiences are processed, adult identity begins to crystallize, and that capacity for abstract thinking enables a sort of new meaning making. So, Purple Hibiscus sort of illustrates this pivotal window of development and the potential for significant intervention and the impact, right? So I think the story also demonstrates Brofenbrenner's ecological systems theory, showing us how the adolescent's immediate family environment and then interactions between family, school, and church, political unrest, and the broader cultural values all profoundly shape development. So this holistic view of adolescence embedded within multiple interacting systems is, of course, consistent with developmental theory. So adolescence portrayed uh, the adolescence that we saw portrayed is showing a period of cognitive, emotional, and identity development, even in the face of the severe oppression. And I think that Adichie is illustrating how adolescent growth is inherently relational, with new social context and relationships catalyzing change. Adolescent development is also, of course, shaped by specific cultural contexts. In this case, we've mentioned Nigerian politics, religious conflicts, and family traditions. It also demonstrates adolescent resilience, so that capacity to grow despite adverse circumstances. So I think these are all providing us the very holistic understanding of adolescence. So adolescence really takes diverse forms across cultural contexts. So we want to avoid imposing Western developmental norms as universal. So, as per usual, effective counseling requires that cultural competency as well as the developmental knowledge. So, we want to think about how culture and development interact in order to be more accurate with assessment and intervention. Fiction like Purple Hibiscus, I think, gives us a way to develop our empathy further and gives us insights into experiences you may not have encountered directly. So, engaging with these diverse narratives, I think, enhances clinical sensitivity and effectiveness. I think that through examining this novel, we're able to develop a more nuanced understanding of development across the lifespan and within diverse cultural contexts.